So I recently took on one of the roughest undertakings in my YouTube experience when I battled the Wildwood Trail in Portland's Forest Park. It was during this excursion that I crossed over Leif Erickson Drive multiple times. Since being introduced to it back in my high school cross-country days, the Leif always interested me. Unlike all the other trails in Forest Park with their rapid switchbacks, the Leif is graceful with its gradual curves, and unlike the other trails and their uneven, rugged, and sometimes treacherous routes, the Leif is wide and even. It always intrigued me, especially with the fact that one could be traveling up Northwest Thurman Street only to find it end abruptly at a gate. The entrance to Leif Erickson Drive, why this path looked so different from all the rest. I knew there had to be a story there, and as I walked the Wildwood, the seeds for looking into this history were planted. This is the brief story behind Leif Erickson Drive, why it's here, why it looks the way it does, and even why it carries the name of a Nordic explorer from a century ago. Interestingly enough, this route's origin story is very much steeped in something that remains an issue in present-day Portland: developers. While today's city finds beautiful historic architecture and any feasible affordable living options being eradicated by today's predatory developers, development of a different kind was on the roll at the beginning of the 1900s. But as Portland was expanding and new neighborhoods were popping up frequently, there was a strong and focused objective by many to protect the rural Tualatin Mountains, where Forest Park exists today, from such a future. By 1903, a plan had already been put into place to develop this land into park space, but such efforts were unsuccessful at the time. Forest Park itself would not become a full reality until 45 years later. With no guaranteed protection of these hills, it was only a matter of time before developers moved in. By 1914, they'd already found success in developing hillside neighborhoods like Willamette Heights, providing purchasers picturesque views of the city below. A massive movement was made to pick up any land possible in the hills that would become Forest Park. Their dream was to have homes peppered all throughout the hills there. But before that dream could become a reality, they needed a road. How else could future homeowners living in the hills get to and from home? In what was originally planned to be just the first in a number of roads running through the hills, the aptly named Hillside Drive began construction, running a winding 11-mile cut from Thurman Street up north to Germantown Road. The drive was completed in 1915. Developers were seeing dollar signs. Future tenants were seeing beautiful and peaceful properties they could call home. However, as we know today, Forest Park is Forest Park. Where are all these homes that were built? What happened? While construction of Hillside Drive costed substantially more than previously planned, which was a hitch, the one thing that really shifted things was nature. In this case, landslides. Yes, landslides saved the Tualatin Mountains and allowed for the creation of Forest Park and all of its beautiful trails. Possibly in part due to logging that had been allowed in the area in previous years, destabilizing the land, landslides became a frequent occurrence, dumping debris down onto the drive over and over again. The primary cause was ultimately deemed to be loose silt that existed all over the hills up there. This made for not only increased costs in maintaining Hillside Drive, but also suggested an ongoing problem that might never go away. Year after year of pouring money into maintaining the road. And what about the questionable stability of the land at this point? Who would want to build a home on such shaky grounds? This suddenly put those who had bought land in those hills in a tight spot, with many of them ultimately defaulting on their land. But still, the city attempted to make these property owners partially responsible for covering the costs of maintaining Hillside Drive. Obviously, these owners didn't really vibe with that idea. The whole dream of development in the hills there had become a nightmare that was ultimately abandoned before the onset of the 1920s, a time in which the drive developed a mystique similar to what we may see in skydiving or bungee jumping today. Over time, the drive became mostly abandoned with the exception of the odd adventurous driver. It was even claimed that car thieves would sometimes stash their stolen rides up there. A piece written in 1928 by an Edward M. Miller for the Oregonian described in detail what a trek down this 11-mile stretch was like. You'd get stuck often, chain up your tires. You had to bring cutting tools and shovels for the likely encounter with a new landslide or a downed tree. And even as Miller and crew drove their Ford Model A's with caution down the road, their vehicles still experienced extensive damage. A ride down Hillside at this time was truly only for those with a desire for adventure, not a casual driver on a Sunday afternoon. After the onset of the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, and with his New Deal prospects came an explosion of public works projects to get people back to work, and back to work with a purpose. The revitalization of Hillside Drive became one of these public works projects at the start of the 1930s, but, with an essence of déjà vu, reoccurring landslides eventually killed the project. With this failure, the drive seemed destined to fade from memory before a fraternal organization stepped forward, known as the Sons of Norway, who put out a petition in 1933 to have the name of Hillside Drive changed. They wanted it named after one of the world's most famous explorers, a man of Nordic background, and possibly the first explorer to set foot on American soil, Leif Erickson. It always boggled my mind why a random trail in a Portland park had such a distinct name like this. None of the other trails did. Sure, some were named after people, but they were always locals, and even then, the trails often only bore their last names, not their full names. But now, some 20 years after first setting foot on that trail, I know why Leif Erickson Drive has the name that it does. And only 15 years after the Sons of Norway were successful in changing the name of this old battered roadway, did Forest Park finally become a reality, transforming the purpose of this drive. But still, with its original purpose, it should no longer come as a surprise that, unlike all the other routes up there, Leif Erickson Drive still looks very much like a road, as opposed to a trail. I know, to most, it's just another path in a park. But still, everything has a story to tell.